This phase doesn't feel dramatic. It can just feel subtly destabilizing. You wake up and nothing is obviously wrong, but you don't feel anchored in your former sense of self. Things you used to care about don't land the same. Things that used to be fun and excite you feel neutral or distant. Conversations with old friends feel slightly misaligned, speaking from a different depth. You might notice you're more sensitive, more tired, less willing to perform versions of yourself that used to feel automatic. And that scares some people, because from the outside, your life may look stable and the same. But internally, things feel different. You don't know how to describe who you are right now. Only who you're not anymore. This is where people start asking themselves quiet questions. Why don't I want what I used to want? Why does forcing myself feel exhausting? Why does pretending feel heavier than resting? You may even miss the old stress, because at least it gave you predictability. This phase can feel lonely, not because you're alone, but because you can't fully meet people from the old position anymore. And you can't yet speak from the new one. Nothing feels solid. But nothing feels fake either. It's an unnerving middle ground, where certainty drops away before coherence has arrived. And most people rush to escape this feeling. They label it. They pathologize it. They try to intellectualize their way out. But what you're experiencing isn't confusion. It's suspension. And suspension feels uncomfortable because it asks you to pause before you understand why. Just stay here with me. Here is the part most people never hear. What's falling away right now isn't your direction. It isn't your purpose. And it isn't your capacity. It's the identity framework that used to organize your life. Identity isn't just a story you tell yourself. It's the internal reference system your nervous system uses to decide what matters, what's safe, what's worth effort, and who you are allowed to be. When that structure starts to loosen, nothing collapses all at once. It destabilizes progressively. That's why this phase feels confusing rather than dramatic. There's no clear ending, no clear beginning, just a sense that the old rules no longer govern your behavior. You may notice that willpower doesn't work the way it used to. Motivation feels unreliable rather than absent. Things you once pushed through now feel disproportionately heavy. That's not laziness. It's not burnout in the usual sense. And it's not regression. It's what happens when the internal organizer updates before the new one is stabilized. Most people assume clarity comes first, that you understand who you're becoming, and then your life rearranges. But for many people, especially perceptive, reflective, or intelligent ones, it happens the other way around. Your perception shifts first. Your tolerance changes. Your nervous system stops cooperating with roles it no longer recognizes as true. And only after that does identity catch up. So you're left in this strange in-between state. This in-between stage is like a chrysalis, not the caterpillar anymore, but not yet the butterfly. From the outside, nothing looks like it's happening. From the inside, the old structure is breaking down at the cellular level. The form that once held everything together dissolves before a new one can emerge. And if you could feel what's happening inside a chrysalis, it wouldn't feel peaceful. It would feel disorienting, unstable, like losing form before gaining one. That's the part no one romanticizes, but it's the part that makes transformation possible. You can't go back, because going back would require pretending. But you can't yet move forward, because the new orientation isn't stable. This is where some people panic. They try to rebuild the old identity because it's familiar, or they rush to adopt a new one because uncertainty feels unbearable. But neither of those resolves the discomfort, because coherence doesn't arrive through replacement. It arrives through completion. The old identity has to finish dissolving before the new one can organize cleanly. And that gap, that uncomfortable, floating, disorienting middle, is not a mistake. It's the pause between internal systems. You're not failing this phase. You're passing through it. And once you understand that, the experience starts to feel different. Not easier yet, but intelligible. And that alone changes how much you fight it. There is a reason this phase feels lonelier than anything that came before it. When identity loosens, you don't just lose roles, you lose mirrors. The people, routines, goals, and narratives that once reflected you back to yourself no longer do. So even kindness can feel hollow. Even encouragement can miss the mark. Not because something is wrong with them, but because the self they're speaking to is no longer fully there. This is the loneliness of no longer being held by familiar meaning. And meaning is what quietly stabilizes most human lives. This phase is also disorienting because attention starts to turn inward. Not deliberately, not spiritually, but because the external world stops pulling on you the same way. Desire weakens, urgency fades, old rewards feel strangely empty. And without those pulls, the mind doesn't know where to orient. So it loops, it searches, it tries to make sense of something that isn't conceptual yet. This is where some people think they're lost. But what's actually happening is that awareness is no longer being propped up by identity. And that feels like free fall. There's another layer people rarely talk about. In this phase, the future goes quiet. Not pessimistic, not hopeless, just absent. The old images of who you were becoming don't motivate you anymore, but new ones haven't formed. So time feels strange. You're not pulled forward. You're not anchored backward. You're suspended in the present, but not the peaceful version people romanticize. This presence feels exposed, and exposure feels threatening to an identity that used to protect you. This is why the phase feels like regression. Not because you're moving backward, but because the psychological structures that once gave you confidence are dissolving before deeper stability is online. You may feel more emotional, more permeable, less defended. That's not weakness. That's what happens when the armor comes off. Before you trust the ground beneath you, fear belongs here. Not dramatic fear, quiet fear. The kind that asks, if I'm not who I was, and I don't yet know who I am, what's holding me? Most people rush to cover this fear with meaning, but meaning comes after this phase, not during it. Right now, what's happening is simpler and more unsettling. The sense of me is loosening, and consciousness is learning how to stand without it. That learning feels empty at first, because identity has always filled the space. This is the void people try to skip. But skipping it creates spiritual personalities, not integrated humans. This space isn't meant to be filled yet. It's meant to be stayed with, not passively, not dramatically, but honestly. And if you can stay here without demanding answers too soon, something begins to organize itself underneath the discomfort, not as a new story, but as a quieter, more stable way of being. We'll talk about that next. What's actually happening here is not mystical, but it is profound. Change doesn't begin with identity. It begins with perception. Perception doesn't change all at once. It changes in how you notice. You start sensing things before you can think about them. You feel when something is off before you can name why. Rooms feel different. People feel different. Even familiar places carry a subtle unfamiliarity. It's not that reality has changed. It's that your relationship to it has. You may notice you can't ignore certain truths anymore. You feel the emotional undertone beneath words. You sense misalignment instantly, and it drains you faster than before. This isn't insight. It's sensitivity. And sensitivity comes online before identity knows how to hold it. That's why you feel exposed. Long before you consciously decide anything, the way you experience reality starts to shift. This shift isn't deliberate. It happens beneath choice. And because perception changes first, the world starts to feel unfamiliar before you understand yourself differently. That's why this phase feels unstable. You're seeing more, but you're still organized around who you used to be. Identity is slower. It's made of habit, memory, conditioning, reward. It's reinforced by repetition and relationship. So when perception upgrades, identity doesn't instantly follow. It lags. And in that lag, you're living with new eyes inside an old structure. That mismatch creates tension. You can't unsee what you now see, but you can't yet live from it either. So reality feels inconsistent. Some days you feel clear. Other days you feel disoriented. Not because you're unstable, but because two internal systems are briefly running at once. This is why the world itself can start to feel strange. Not unreal, not meaningless, but less gripping. The things that once anchored you. Goals, roles, timelines, expectations. No longer pull you forward with the same force. You still understand them. You just don't feel organized by them. So life loses its usual tension. And without tension, the mind doesn't know where to stand. That's when reality starts to feel thinner, less solid, less structured, less certain. Not because it's falling apart, but because the filter that once gave it shape is dissolving. You're no longer inside the story the same way. You're standing closer to the raw experience of being here, without the familiar narrative holding it together. And that rawness can feel unsettling, because identity doesn't just explain life, it stabilizes it. So when that stabilizer loosens, the mind interprets the openness as loss. But what's actually happening is that reality is being experienced with fewer buffers, more directly, more honestly, more vulnerably. And until identity reorganizes around this new way of seeing, everything feels unfinished. This is the middle zone. Perception has shifted. Identity hasn't caught up, and meaning is temporarily suspended between the two. Nothing has gone wrong. You're not meant to stabilize this phase through effort. Stability returns when identity reorganizes around the new perception, not when perception is forced back into old identity. That takes time, and patience, and staying present without demanding certainty too early. Once this alignment completes, reality feels solid again, but not in the old way, in a quieter way, a less defended way, a more truthful way. And when that happens, this entire phase will make sense, not intellectually, but retrospectively. This is where people make this phase harder than it needs to be. Not because they're doing something wrong, but because they're trying to fix what isn't broken. Here's the warning most people never hear. If you try to stabilize this phase too early, you prolong it. This is where people force decisions, rebuild old identities, cling to meaning, rush certainty, and it feels productive, but it keeps the system from completing its reorganization. Stay with me, because this next part matters. This phase doesn't require action. It requires orientation. Imagine your internal compass is recalibrating. While it's recalibrating, the needle spins. North disappears. Every direction feels wrong at once. If you start walking while the compass is spinning, you don't find your way. You wander in circles. The mistake isn't moving slowly. The mistake is moving before orientation returns. This phase is that recalibration. Your sense of direction hasn't failed. It's temporarily offline while a more accurate one comes online. Trying to force certainty now is like demanding directions from a compass that's still resetting. Orientation comes back, but only if you let the needle settle. Orientation means understanding where you are without trying to move out of it. And that alone changes everything. Most people think clarity comes from answers. It doesn't. It comes from letting the internal system finish updating. If you interrupt that process, you don't return to stability. You loop. This is why some people stay almost there for years. In a few minutes, I'll explain how this phase resolves naturally. But first, you need to understand what not to interfere with. Because the instinct to fix is the last reflex of the old identity trying to survive. And once you see that, you stop fighting the process that's already working. This phase doesn't resolve because you figure it out. It resolves because the system completes its reorganization. Perception shifts first. Identity follows later. When identity finally catches up to how you're already seeing, the friction disappears. Not all at once. Quietly, the mind stops searching. The nervous system stops bracing. Direction returns without effort. Nothing new is added. What returns is coherence. You don't become someone else. You become aligned. And when that happens, the void doesn't close with answers. It closes with stability. That's how you know the phase is complete. Nothing dramatic happens at the end of this phase. There's no breakthrough moment, no announcement, no sudden certainty. What returns first is subtle. A quieter sense of yes and no. Less urgency to explain yourself. Less pressure to decide who you are. Life starts to feel solid again. Not because you figured it out, but because something inside you finished reorganizing. You didn't force this, you didn't fix it. You let it complete. And later, often much later, you realize you're living differently, without remembering when the shift happened. That's how this phase resolves. Subscribe for more educational content that helps to raise our collective consciousness. Until next time.